Good morning and welcome to the latest quarterly BCIS outlook for construction. Please feel free to ask any questions you have throughout the webinar using the chat box. I'll get through as many of them as time permits, and for those questions that we don't get around to airing during the session, we'll continue the discussion using the BCIS LinkedIn group. Also, the session is being recorded and made available on BCIS. So if you encounter any technology problems, don't worry. You'll still get the chance to watch, and hopefully you can ask any questions you may have after the event. The other thing to touch on a bit in terms of housekeeping is when leaving the session, you'll be prompted to give feedback on the event. We'd be grateful if you could do that. The feedback will help us make sure we're delivering the sort of content that you want. So please do take the time out to answer, and also feel free to let us know if you have any topics that you'd like us to focus on for future events. So let's make a start. I'm sure you're all aware of the press coverage regarding labour shortages, particularly skilled trades, and clients having difficulties attracting contractors to bid for projects. And it's looking like labour is set to become the next cost driver, given that materials are now stabilising. We're predicting that labour cost will probably be the main inflation driver going forward. So today we're going to look at construction inflation. Is delivery a problem because we can't access enough skilled operatives to deliver our projects? So to address that question, we'll look at industry capacity in construction, and to do that we'll need to look at demand, look at our forecasts for future demand levels, and then we'll take a look at the current supply position. We'll look at numbers employed, number of firms, whether the rise in insolvencies is having an impact. And then we'll briefly assess if there's a mismatch between supply and demand in construction. We'll then draw some conclusions, and at the end we'll take some questions. So let's set the scene. Anecdotally, we're hearing a lot about shortages of labour, clients being unable to attract firms to bid, tender for their projects, and indeed even on very large projects. I mean, HS2 is the latest to say that they're struggling to recruit skilled labour and are likely to suffer with shortages, which could indeed extend the project life cycle. I mean, we've started to take a look at this, and a recent thought piece that BCIS has drafted called Construction Labour: Will the Shortage Occupation List Make a Difference? That's available on our website. And that's a quick review of the government's shortage occupation list, and the addition of 5 construction trades to that list to make it easier for workers from abroad to get visas. Now we just have assessed the likely impact of that, so it's definitely worth having a look at that paper if you're interested. So the cost and availability of labour is anticipated to be a major barrier to the delivery of construction projects over the next year or so. But is this hyperbole or is it fact? So we're going to have a quick look at that today, and we'll look at the current capacity of construction. On the following slide, we'll start to take a look at the demand levels. But before we do that, it probably makes sense to outline what capacity is, and whether or not there is a capacity problem. So industry capacity represents the maximum amount of goods or services that companies can supply in a period. And when there is undercapacity and demand exceeds supply, market players have high pricing power, and therefore the price of the product increases. Counter to that, the reverse is true when there's overcapacity, so there's too many firms. So what's the current situation in the UK construction industry? Is there a mismatch between supply and demand? Let's take a look at the demand position now. So our analysis of the demand position, we'll take a look at current and then forecast demand for construction, and we use a combination of data sources. We use ONS data, and then obviously we use BCIS forecasting data. So here we're looking at construction output using ONS data. The top line, heavy blue line, is total construction. Second line down is new work, and third line is repair and maintenance output. Total output is now above pre-crisis levels, but this has largely been driven by growth in repair and maintenance output. If you look at the new work output, it's still below the levels from 2017, and output declined in the latest quarter. So if we take a quick look at the two broad output sectors, that's new work and repair and maintenance. On this slide, we're looking at new construction output, and we have real data and forecast data included on this slide. So new construction output is expected to contract in the next year, 2023 to 24, before returning to growth 25 going on forwards, and increasing about 13% over the forecast period, so that's 2023 to 2028. Private housing is the largest sector, which represents over a third of total new work output. Clearly any decline in this sector, given its size, is likely to have a significant effect on overall output. And if we take a look at the slide, we can see that there's a decline forecast. We're predicting a decline in private housing output, given the issues in that sector at the moment, with falling demand, slightly driven by increases in interest rates, difficulties financing mortgages, and I think the supply position, certainly in housing, currently exceeds demand. So property developers are sort of stalling their schemes. In London and the big cities, there's also been an impact from the second staircase rule, which has led to a lot of projects being needed to be redesigned, and we're predicting significant decline in private housing over the next year, with some recovery forecast going forward. The next largest new work subsector is infrastructure, and infrastructure output is currently at historically high levels, and despite a sort of slight levelling off in 2022, there's a pipeline of projects, including major projects such as Hinkley Point C, the completion of the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and obviously the largest project in the country, HS2. That's likely to drive output throughout the forecast period, and we expect steady growth in infrastructure through to 2028. The next largest subsector is private commercial. But in 2022, private commercial output was actually down almost 30% since 2019. And if you go back a bit further to the start of the chart, it's down almost 40% since 2007, which is, I mean, I remember when private commercial was the largest subsector of new work. So that picture has changed dramatically over the last 15 years since the financial crisis. We're not predicting any further dramatic declines in private commercial, but we expect that any recovery will be slow as the requirements for both office and retail space have changed fundamentally. Given that, if you take a look at repair and maintenance output now, given that R&M is becoming an increasingly important sector, we thought we'd devote some time to looking at R&M. Now there's some drop-off evident in our forecast for R&M output, but recovery is fairly strong towards the end of the forecast period, and the recovery is driven by increases in both private housing and non-housing repair and maintenance work. In the next slide, we'll take a look at the individual subsectors and give you a quick outline of how we expect them to perform over the next few years. So if we quickly summarise our growth predictions by sector following the latest data releases, and this slide is fundamentally unchanged from the previous quarterly outlook. So new housing, we suspect will decline. There's currently an unfavourable investment climate, and as we touched on previously, supply currently exceeds demand levels. New infrastructure, there is a limit to public spending, and we're aware of some projects being delayed or amended. Obviously, the much publicised HS2 not terminating in Euston is one amendment, and also another big project, the Lower Thames Crossing project, has been postponed by a couple of years, the start date. So there are some problems in the infrastructure sector, but we suspect that levels are likely to remain strong. New public non-housing, there's obviously, as mentioned, a limit to public spending, so we suspect investment will be curtailed in that sector. New commercial we touched on just before, and there's currently an unfavourable investment climate in that sector. We don't expect there to be too much growth. Similarly, with new industrial. So if we switch to repair and maintenance, again we're forecasting a decline in R&M housing output. We suspect that the latest interest rate rises and the continuing cost of living impacts are likely to constrain investment in R&M in housing. The one sector that we are sort of fairly bullish about is repair and maintenance in the infrastructure sector. There's likely to be an increase in spending in that sector due to a lack of new work investment. So that's the one sort of bright spot in our subsector growth predictions. R&M in public non-housing and private non-housing, again, we suspect that there's a limit to public spending in the public non-housing sector, and there's less investment available given the current economic position in the commercial and industrial sectors. So to summarise the output position, it looks like demand is softening. There are some growth areas, but they're pretty few and far between. If we now switch our attention to costs and prices, on this slide we're looking at the growth in the BCIS General Building Cost Index and all-in tender price index, and looking at the forecasts, you can see that they certainly look relatively benign compared to the recent past. Tender prices in second quarter 2023 rose by about 1% compared with the previous quarter, and by almost 5% on the same time last year. So annual growth in tender prices is expected to continue to ease, and we estimate that it will be at about 2.4% in the second quarter of 24. We're expecting contractors to absorb some of the pressure from increased wages, and not pass them on in elevated tender prices, certainly not over the next year. It's not until the sort of second quarter of 2025, so 2 years hence, that tender prices are likely to rise faster than costs. And that's largely because we're expecting the demand position to improve at that point. So the likelihood is that tender price increases will be passed on. Over the period, we're expecting tender prices to rise by about 16% in the 5 years from second quarter 23 to second quarter 2028. Building costs, as measured by the BCIS General Building Cost Index, continue to follow the downward trend from a recent peak of almost 15%. Seen in the second quarter of 2022. The slowdown in the growth of construction costs is mainly attributed to the fall in material cost inflation. We've seen that come down considerably. Over our forecast period, the GBCI is likely to grow by 3.5% in the 12 months to the second quarter of 23. And costs are predicted to rise by about 16% over the next 5 years, so 2023 to second quarter 2028. Now, on this slide, let's take a look at what's been driving the increases in the General Building Cost Index and all-in tender price index. And we can clearly see on this slide that materials cost inflation has eased significantly, and this is largely because the supply chain issues that impacted the sector over the last few years have mostly been resolved. The first 5 months of this year, we've continued to see a general slowdown in material price inflation, and this is largely due to better product availability. Annual growth in the BCIS Materials Cost Index has continued to fall from its peak of almost 25% observed this time last year, and slowed to 9.9% in the first quarter of 2023. It's still worth remembering that this slide is showing growth levels. So these are absolute levels, and this is also the same for general inflation in the wider economy. The cost and prices are certainly slowing, increases are slowing, but the levels are obviously still significantly higher than they were three or 4 years ago. So it's definitely worth bearing that in mind. This is just saying that the rate of increases are slowing, but the levels are significantly higher than they were. So materials pricing are expected to go up by 3% in the 12 months to second quarter 23. And although overall the availability of materials is almost at pre-COVID levels, and energy prices are certainly going down, costs for some materials, especially those that require an energy-intensive manufacturing process, are still seeing some higher growth rates. So touching on what we discussed right at the start of this outlook, The availability, increasing cost of labour remain hot topics for our industry. Labour site rates continue to rise faster than wage awards and are expected to become the main driver of growth in overall costs in the second half of 2023. And if we look at the chart, you can see the uptick in the near-term forecasts as labour costs are rising and material costs are falling. So we're looking at a sort of 10%, just under 10% uptick in labour costs over the next year. We suspect that labour site rates will certainly wage awards over the next year are likely to come under pressure from high inflation, and I think there's going to be a period of catch up with people looking to have increases that will maybe not cover the whole economy inflation levels, but certainly will go towards sort of offsetting some of those rises. So we're predicting sort of annual growth in the BCIS Labour Cost Index at around 5% in the second quarter of 24, and then 8.3% in the second quarter of 2024. So you can see that labour costs are now predicted to be the main driver for any increases in costs and prices. So if we now take a look at our predictions for market conditions, it's worth just remembering that when the market conditions index is rising, prices are rising faster than costs, and when it's falling, costs are rising faster than prices. Increases that we've just seen, that we're predicting for site labour rates, will likely push costs ahead of prices in the first 2 years of our forecast, before prices lead costs later in the forecast, so towards the end of 26 through to 28. And it's also worth noting from this chart that the market conditions factor is looking much more benign over the forecast period than it has over the last decade. So that's something to bear in mind. As is customary with these webinars, we'll also take a look at the views from our BCIS industry panel. And the reason for including this is that there's only so much the data can tell you. I am a data person, and I do love data, but because of the lag in producing statistics, a lot of certainly official statistics are dated because of the length of time it takes to collect and produce them. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But that leads us to the industry panel, which happened a couple of weeks ago. So we've got sort of views from the ground that are slightly ahead of where the data might currently be. So if we look at some of the comments made by the panel members, we can get an understanding of what's happening on the ground in construction at the moment. So in terms of procurement, we've got a comment about reducing capacity, which leading to contractors being more selective on the tender routes they're willing to work. They're preferably going for two-stage and adding inflation pressures onto prices. Another one noted the volatility is still being priced into fixed price contracts, so expectations of bidders are that prices are likely to keep rising. And another one about contractors being keen to secure turnover, where a number of projects comprising taller buildings have been paused due to the time for redesigning for the introduction of the second staircase, something we touched on a couple of slides before. In terms of sectors, hotspots in infrastructure, and interestingly commercial fit out, which I wasn't expecting, and comments about the housing market having slowed in London and major cities, largely because of the demand problems we mentioned, but also the introduction of the second staircase rule. Now if we turn to the view of inflation by panel members, there is an area that's been flagged by them, and it's mechanical and electrical, and price rises in M&E are still not showing any signs of slowing compared to general building works, and this is likely to be, or largely because of the supply of M&E goods is still an issue, which means that contractors can't fix prices. So that's definitely an area worth noting. Another comment about the general slowdown in material inflation, material cost inflation, but growing wage inflation, something that we've also noticed. In terms of particular items, concrete prices have been rising, steelwork and reinforcement have gone down, but labour is going up across the board, sort of highlighting the issues and the data that we discussed earlier. Another one about generally better material availability, and this was an interesting comment, I think. The steel and concrete industries are opting for cleaner and less carbon intensive materials, and this is being seen to have an impact in costs. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Finally, with panel members, we sort of discussed challenges they were facing, and probably seen press coverage about this as well. I certainly have. Increasing numbers of insolvencies as a result of the wider economic conditions. So that's something to watch. Then again, the application of the second staircase rule has been very disruptive. Another one about insolvencies on projects remaining a major concern. And this penultimate one, the rising cost of construction, skilled labour shortages and lack of confidence in the market to invest in new projects are three of the main challenges currently facing contractors. And this from the client side, it's generally about uncertainty. So a combination of insolvency risk, increased fire regulations, product evolution, labour shortages and material panics are causing clients to actually look at the viability of projects. So that's something to be very cautious about. So we've looked at the latest demand position, and we've seen to some extent that demand is softening. Material costs are stabilising. There is some upward pressure in terms of labour costs, and we do expect them to be the major driver over the next few years. So we looked at demand. Let's now look at the current supply position in construction, and to do this we have to use ONS data. So this slide shows the numbers employed and self-employed, and those two added together for total employment in construction. This is based on ONS data, and the data sort of supports what we've been touching on previously. It suggests a declining trend in the total employed in construction since the pandemic. and most of that decline has come from falling numbers of self-employed workers. And this tends to tally with the anecdotal evidence that we've been hearing. If you look at the chart, you can see that the numbers of directly employed have also fallen, but by a much smaller proportion than the self-employed. In comparison to put some numbers on it, in comparison to pre-pandemic levels, sort of fourth quarter 2019, the overall construction workforce has shrunk by 181,000 people. 98% of those were self-employed. So you can see the volume of the decline it is significant. Something else we've been hearing a lot about over the last year or so is the number of construction insolvencies, number of businesses going bust, and again this is based on ONS data, and you can clearly see on the chart that it certainly highlights the period of government support for businesses during the pandemic via both the furlough scheme and business loans. And having said it, you can certainly see as the various support schemes unwound in 2021 that the number of insolvencies increased dramatically before levelling off last year. Civil engineering businesses appear least affected as demand has largely held up in that sector. But interestingly, sort of specialist construction firms, which include demolition and site preparation, electrical and plumbing installation, completion and finishing of buildings. So they're described as specialist construction firms in ONS parlance. They've fared much worse over the period in terms of insolvencies. It does look like the growth rate has stabilised, but it is still high when compared to pre-pandemic levels. If we also take a look at the number of construction firms that are currently trading, and given the data presented on the previous slides in terms of numbers employed and falling and the number of insolvencies increasing, you'd probably reasonably expect that the number of firms would also be declining. But looking at the data here, the opposite it appears to be the case. The trend clearly shows the number of construction businesses growing almost exponentially since 2014, and that's despite the recent crises that we've been through. So from the data presented, the question arises: if output is now back to pre-pandemic levels, and the number of firms is increasing, but the number of workers is declining, are we delivering similar levels of output with less workers? That leads us on to productivity, and productivity measures how much output can be generated per unit of input. And there are certainly more appropriate data for measuring productivity, but that's not really the purpose of this webinar, and perhaps we need another one to look at this in more detail in future. Historically, construction has been regarded as having relatively low productivity compared to other sectors of the economy, although it must be noted that measurement problems are significant, not only in construction but across other sectors. So, given what we've seen today in terms of the demand and supply position, I thought it'd be interesting if we sort of crudely look at productivity, and we'll just take output, construction output, and divide it by total employment. To see the trend in output generated per unit of input. In other words, what we call the labour productivity ratio. Now, the data suggests that the labour productivity ratio in construction has improved since the pandemic. In other words, we're getting more output for less input. The chart clearly shows the impact of the shutdown in the second quarter of 2020, where the drop-off in the productivity ratio as sites were shut down. But since the reopening, the productivity ratio can be seen to have increased steadily and is now significantly higher than the productivity ratio recorded pre-pandemic. In fact, there's been a 20% increase since 2019, and this is really quite an interesting and significant finding. Albeit, we must bear in mind that the data sources used to generate this comparison are not strictly the data sources that economists would use to measure labour productivity. But in this instance, I thought it would just be a useful exercise to see if there'd been an impact on productivity, and there certainly seems to have been. So, if we summarise what we've discussed today in the next few slides, and try and address the question set right at the start, is there a mismatch between supply and demand? In other words, are there currently capacity problems in the construction sector? What does the data tell us? Well, it says that total output is back to pre-crisis levels, although it's worth noting that we're expecting future demand to soften, and it's likely to remain relatively subdued over the next 5 years. Anecdotally, it appears that there's a supply imbalance, with reports of difficulty securing contractors and site operatives. However, the data we've looked at doesn't really support that notion. Is there perhaps something more structural happening? Are we currently delivering similar levels of output with less workers? From the data that we've presented, it certainly seems that is the case. So in conclusion, and returning to our original question, is delivery a problem? Looking at the ONS data that we presented from the supply side, so despite the number of insolvencies having risen and the numbers employed falling, the number of firms and labour productivity both appear to be increasing. So has the industry become more efficient? Something that it's been striving for all the decades that I've been involved with it. So are there real shortages, or are contractors and trades being more selective on the projects they are willing to work on? The market certainly seems to be at a turning point as input cost inflation and demand pressures both fall. And this is likely to see tender price inflation slowing going forward, which should allow investors some incentive to take project forwards. And that may well result in an uptick in demand. And then we can see, again, if we look at capacity when demand picks up, that might give us a better indication of what's actually happening on the supply side. But certainly from the data we've looked at today, it looks like the pressure seems to be off. But I'll caveat that by saying off for now. Let's take a couple of questions. We still have a few minutes left. Here's a good one. Where have all the workers gone? Good question. I think generally speaking, the UK labour force is currently smaller than it was prior to the pandemic, and that's obviously also impacted construction. I mean, I think when compared to pre-pandemic levels, the overall construction workforce has shrunk in part, probably because of long-term sickness amongst older age cohorts, some levels of retirement as well, and because construction is quite a physical, certainly at a trade level, is a physical activity. And the demographics of labour employed tends to be skewed towards the older in construction. I think the long-term sickness and retirement issue is probably significant. There's evidence that that trend was emerging before the pandemic, so it's not strictly speaking just pandemic related. I also think that Brexit probably had an adverse effect on the construction workforce. EU workers returned to their home countries, and some have, or other countries for that matter, not just their home countries. And I think if any wanted to come back, they've probably been unable to fulfil employment requirements, or have indeed chosen to work in other countries that are still part of the EU. I think there are estimates, and I suspect these would have been quite difficult to calculate, but because it's very difficult to separate other effects from Brexit effects, given that the pandemic happened at a similar time. You don't know, you can't separate the two, unfortunately. But the Centre for European Reform has tried, and they estimate that the end of free movement of labour led to a loss of about 46,000 workers in construction. So it's, it is a significant number, and I also think over the last 2 or 3 years, and with the economic struggles that we've had in this country, it's probably become a less attractive place for migrant workers. We've got higher inflation than a lot of other places in Europe, and also a weaker currency, and obviously they would be paid in a local currency, which is currently quite weak. I mean, the government is trying to implement steps to improve the possibility of foreign workers coming to the UK, and with the addition of 5 trades on the shortage occupation list, that may encourage people from probably further afield than Europe, I would imagine, to apply for work visas at a trade level. And I mean, construction generally is certainly construction work on site. It's generally physical, and I think many view the industry as sort of relatively low tech, manual labour with limited opportunities for progression. And I think we really do need to change this view, to try and attract new entrants, to replace those that the industry have lost, and that's for whatever reason. We're rapidly running out of time. We've probably just got a chance for one more question. So we've highlighted labour as being the biggest cost driver going forward, and the question's based on is what are your labour indices based on. That's what are the BCIS labour cost indices based on. They're essentially based on nationally agreed wage awards. So we have them for individual trades, and they include overtime based on an assumption of on working hours derived from the ONS annual survey of hours and earnings, and we review those annually. They include allowances for travelling and tools covered by the appropriate working rule agreement, holiday pay covered by the working rule agreement, sick pay covered by the working rule agreement, national insurance. The indices are applicable to the UK and relate to calendar months. The monthly indices are compiled so that changes are included in the index for the month in which they occur by weighting them according to the number of days to which the changes apply. So it's essentially, we forecast based on national wage awards. There are obviously other measures, the ONS average weekly earnings series, and we also have the BCIS and Hayes site labour index. So there are various measures used, but we are confident in our predictions that labour cost increases are likely to be the driver of inflation going forward in our sector. Okay, sorry, we're slightly over time. Appreciate your involvement, and as I say, please, as we said at the beginning, if you've got any questions that we haven't had a chance to get to, then please submit and online, and we'll address as many as we can. Many thanks for your time, and see you soon. Thanks.